Hello, good morning to those joining us in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. My name is Léonie Allard. I'm a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. It's a pleasure to open this event today on behalf of the Europe Center and the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council, where we'll unpack China's relationship with Europe ahead of next week's visit by President Xi Jinping to France, Serbia, and Hungary. As our audience will know, for years now, the EU has described its relationship with China as one of competition, cooperation, and systemic rivalry, all in one. But most recently, we've seen some shifts, with the European Commission driving forward a de-risking agenda reflecting a real sense of unease in Europe's relationship with China. The EU has further expanded in its toolbox with the adoption of the EU's anti-coercion instrument, new investigations into the Chinese market practices from EVs to medical devices, and the release of an economic security strategy, including new initiatives on FDI, export controls, and outbound investment. China's enduring support and partnership with Russia since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine made it hard to separate China from Russia's legal and violent challenge to Europe's security. And over the last few weeks, Europe has been rocked by allegations of Chinese espionage. And at the same time, and maybe because of this, Beijing has stepped up its diplomatic efforts with Europe. On May 5th, President Xi Jinping will embark on a 6-day trip to Paris, Belgrade, and Budapest, his first trip to the continent since 2019. This trip is coming on the back of German Chancellor Scholz and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte's own visits to Beijing, which to some call into question how unified Europe is on China. All the while, we're watching here from Washington how the visit will go and what this will mean for transatlantic coordination on China. We have a lot to discuss, and I'm eager to hear from today's panelists, so I'll leave it here. Before I turn over to my colleagues, I just want to invite everyone to follow along with the Council's work on China through our Global China Hub and stay connected on all things Europe and transatlantic affairs through the Europe Center's Transatlantic Relations series, which charts an ambitious agenda for the United States and Europe for 2025 and beyond. So without further ado, let me welcome my great group of experts around the virtual table. So joining us from Paris, we have François Godement, Special Advisor and Resident Senior Fellow for Asia and America at the Institut Montaigne. From DC, we have our very own Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. We also have Noah Buchan, Senior Advisor at Rhodium Group and Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, where he writes the now famous Watching China in Europe newsletter. And finally, we have Stefan Vladislavlev, Program Director at the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence for Responsible Society, who's an expert on China's presence in Serbia and the Western Balkans. Before I jump right into the discussion, a quick note on housekeeping. We'd love to hear your audience questions. You can submit your questions at askac.org. Make sure to follow us on Twitter and AC Europe as well. With that, I'd like to start with my opening question to François, a more general question on the optics of the visit from a European perspective, of Xi choosing these 3 countries as a first trip to the EU since the pandemic began. When Xi sits down with Macron and von der Leyen for talks, what messages will the Europeans be trying to get across? And what will France also be trying to get across?
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm unmuted. Thanks, Leonie, for your introduction. And I'll try to answer your questions. First, noting that if there is a charm offensive, it's been going on for more than a year with sweet talking by Chinese diplomats, but usually not accompanied by any concessions that we might have noticed. So facts are a bit behind the curve. Is Xi Jinping going to change that? I have my doubts because the charm offensive that's focusing mainly on Serbia and Hungary, of course also on France, which is unavoidable in a way as a partner, but which is here is taken in the Chinese interpretation as the autonomous or independent country that President Macron sometimes talks about. So it's not completely inconsistent with the choice of Serbia and Hungary, even though the French obviously would not recognize it. Second, did President Xi Jinping know a few weeks ago that Ursula von der Leyen would be in Paris and would be talking to him at the same time? I'm not absolutely sure of that, especially given the fact that Chancellor Scholz had gone to Beijing a few weeks ago without even a peep about Europe and as a purely bilateral German visit. So this, in effect, sets quite a different stage for President Macron, first to have met Chancellor Scholz yesterday night and presumably conferred about the meeting with Xi, and second, to bring Mrs. von der Leyen along. For the past few years, Chinese negotiators have studiously avoided Brussels and mostly focused on bilateral relations, while the diplomats have usually complained in European capitals about what they call an unacceptable line from Brussels. They usually focus on systemic rivalry. Now they are talking about the anti-dumping investigation on EVs. So it's not a completely rosy surrounding that is there for this visit.
Thank you so much, Francois. Before I turn to our other European guests, Dave, you're our China expert at the Council. So I would love to hear from you what China is looking for and your reaction to Francois' remark as to the charm offensive has been going on, and but at the same time, Europe has changed since this charm offensive began.
Thanks, Leonie. Great to be on this panel, and I agree with everything that Francois said. I think, this is, if it's a charm offensive, which I think it is, it has been going on for some time now. This is just obviously at the higher level now with Xi Jinping himself coming to Europe, and I think the goal broadly is to try to stem what has been a fairly remarkable deterioration if you step back and look at this in the broader sweep of years in China's ties with Europe. And I think she wants to prevent EU actions and further alignment with the United States in areas critical to China, such as on economic issues and tariffs. But as Francois said, to do all of this by offering words and not deeds. And I will be very surprised if she comes ready to offer any concessions on the EU's, I think, very legitimate concerns about China's policies. I think specifically in France, she will be coming to look to somewhat to repair relations in Europe that have been significantly damaged by China's support for Russia's war on Ukraine, prevent the further blacklisting of Chinese companies by the EU that have supported Russia. And I think, China, again, wants to stem the bleeding, portray China as a responsible player, not as Russia's benefactor, but without any concessions that I would expect on its aid and support for Russia. And the United States and Secretary Blinken have been pushing even harder on this notion that China has been supporting Russia's ability to rebuild its defense industrial base and offering all these dual-use equipment to the Russians that are helping them to prosecute their illegal war on Ukraine. And I think we also aren't expecting to see anything in terms of China's willingness to push Russia to come to the table for negotiations that are based on anything looking like an actual withdrawal from territory gained in Ukraine. So I think that's what we're going to see on the Russia front. And then, Francois mentioned the economic issues. I think perhaps these are most immediate. China wants to blunt the EU's economic security agenda vis-a-vis China, its efforts to level the playing field. And there's probably some hope on Xi's part that he can move France's position on potential tariffs and other issues more toward the German position, away from Brussels. There will be a lot of talk about economic complementarity. There's, again, no coincidence here that this is a time when the EU is threatening tariffs. France has been a leader in pushing for the Commission's investigation into China's EV subsidies. But I don't think there's going to be any concessions here either on China's overcapacity push, its subsidies, or anything that Europe wants at this time. So I think Beijing is betting that EU member states' disunity, the enduring draw of the China market, these are all going to collectively stall the economic measures that Europe is considering. And as I'm sure others will talk about, China has some good reasons to think this, given what we've seen from Chancellor Scholz's visit and from other things out of other countries in Europe. So on these two areas, support for Russia, China's economic practices, she's really going to be looking to paper over the costs of China's positions and prevent both unity within Europe and greater alignment with the United States. And I think the messaging in France is going to underscore, Europe as an independent pole in an increasingly multipolar world. Don't side with an unnamed other player on issues that don't really align with European interests.
Thank you so much, Dave. Now, if I could turn to Noah, Francois and Dave have opened with the issue of European unity, and I'd be interested in your perspective from the German point of view and relative to France. How is Scholz going to manage? Are we going to have common and coordinated messaging between France and Germany? What are the outstanding issues on China?
Well, thanks, Leonie, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me. Very good to be here. I think Germany came out with a China strategy last year, almost a year ago, that used tougher language than Germany has used in the past on China. The focus was very much on de-risking, on diversification, reducing dependencies, and also embedding the German approach to China in a more European umbrella. I don't think we've seen a lot of any of that in the year since this strategy was unveiled. I think the divisions within the German government are well documented. We have a coalition government here in Berlin. The Greens, who hold the foreign and economy ministries, have been quite hawkish, and they were the driving force behind this China strategy. And the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, is more risk averse, and I think the economic backdrop in Germany at the moment is playing a role in this. Germany had an addiction to Russian gas, and that was shut off overnight. There's a great deal of concern about energy prices here, about deindustrialization. Big companies are cutting jobs in Germany, investing in China and in the United States. Macron warned about this in his Europe speech several days ago. So there is a degree of risk aversion, and we saw that on the Scholz trip to Beijing, where Scholz, I think in his public remarks, we don't know what he said to Xi behind closed doors, but in his public remarks, I thought very mild comments, both on the trade issues, playing down the issue of subsidies and overcapacities, and not really expressing any serious concerns about China's support for Russia, which Janet Yellen a week before Scholz and Anthony Blinken a week or two after him, that this was their main message. So we have a bit of a divided government here in Germany, and I don't think Europe is united. I think Ursula von der Leyen has tried over the past year to sort of herd the cats towards a common policy, and I think she's done a good job of that, laying out a clear agenda. But we're clearly not there yet, and I think the fact that Scholz is unlikely to go to Paris for this meeting with Xi, this will be Macron and von der Leyen, I believe. The contrast with 5 years ago when Merkel, Jean-Claude Juncker, and Macron sat down with Xi is quite stark, and I'm sure China, for Xi Jinping, he's happy to have Scholz sitting in Berlin or wherever he's going to be.
Thank you, Noah. Now I'll turn to our last speaker, Stefan. I'd be interested, again, staying on the issue of unity and the optics of this visit, if you had a word on Hungary and on China's geopolitical interest in the Western Balkans in general, and what role Serbia is playing in that region.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invite, and it is something definitely that needs to be looked as a very specific issue in the broader context of not only Xi Jinping's visit to Europe from 5th to 10th, but in general developments over the past decade or so. And on one side, Hungary, and on the other side, the Western Balkans are very two different cases, with one staple, Hungary being part of European Union, and Western Balkan countries being aspiring countries and potential members, with Serbia as a leading prime example of how you can actually be very open to the Chinese influence and to above mentioned charm offensive. But expectations from the visits are quite similar. We are expecting narratives both in Belgrade but also in Budapest, which will pretty much glorify what has been done so far in the development of bilateral relationship, putting it outside of the context or either functioning within the EU system for Hungary or functioning within the European integration model, which a country that has a candidate status should walk to. If we are defining European position currently as the one of de-risking, Serbia is a country that has recently signed the FTA agreement with China, that has slowly developing military and defense cooperation with China, and has China as a #1 provider of foreign direct investments in a country, is pretty much doing opposite of what de-risking should or is. Again, as a country that doesn't have European Union membership status, Serbian authorities are often describing this approach as something that, as a sovereign country and autonomous country, they have full right to do so, which one can or cannot dispute depending on the fact whether do you want to see Serbia as a part of European Union tomorrow or you do not. So that is a question that is hanging above the heads of the Serbian decision makers, but I don't expect that we will hear any definitive answer during the visit. We will be focusing mostly on the bilateral relationship between Belgrade and Beijing, the celebration of the past 15 years of still friendship, which is one of the terms often used to describe partnership between Serbia and China, but we will also not really put into the context of European integration or some of the potentially negative consequences that have came out of the increased Chinese presence in Serbia, both in the political but also in economic spectrum as well.
Thank you, Stefan. I think we've had a really broad overview of in general how China is approaching the region and what are the overarching goals. I'd be interested to hear from each of you now, what are 2 or 3 deliverables that Europeans want out of this? Is there any positive agenda or negative agenda that you could point us to? François on France, of course, Noah on Germany and Hungary, and Stefan on Serbia. And Dave, I would love for you to conclude on how the US is viewing all of this. These evolutions and these deliverables that may come out from these visits. Over to you, François.
Let's be very concrete and start with small things. Over nearly the past decade, China has only delivered 2 kinds of concessions to the EU. One is usually about agricultural exports. Everybody forgets that for so-called health reasons, various meats and what we call charcuterie, prepared meat, are banned in China. Well, China has this game of, slowly letting in Ireland, Poland, the French, I think, gained charcuterie. I hear that Chancellor Scholz gained beef but failed to gain pork at his last visit. That's the kind of thing that leaves a margin for the Chinese negotiators. The second thing is grand global politics, common goods. The French rejoiced in the past that at Kigali, they got some kind of agreement on biodiversity. There's been stuff about preventing deforestation, although preventing deforestation in China has meant that the Chinese buy wood all over the world and sometimes has the opposite effect. This kind of thing, I think, has about run its course. Then we have got FDI, Chinese FDI now. And the country that looks like it's cashing in is Hungary. It's already cashed in a BYD factory. I'm wondering whether there'll be a second deal during Xi Jinping's visit, which would be a message, by the way, to the others and to Brussels about the investigation on subsidies. We're already in Europe, in the single market. thanks to Hungary, perhaps even with EU structural funds helping. And that's something that the Chinese could do rather easily. I don't expect that the French will succeed in what they have tried to do, including when Macron was in Beijing, which was get an EV factory, a BYD factory in France. For various reasons, it's unlikely to happen. Then let's jump on to bigger things. The one big collective ask, at least from most member states, would be Russia, Ukraine. As I think Dave correctly said, we're very unlikely to get it. And the ones who are able to set red lines to prevent the Chinese from overstepping some of these red lines, which currently merely means refraining from exporting weapons themselves, perhaps dual use items, yes, but weapons, no. It's the United States rather than Europe. But I think that the fact that von der Leyen, also a former Minister of Defense from Germany, before being the EU Commissioner, and Macron are going to repeat again to Xi Jinping how much this is unacceptable. Other types of deliveries, I'm thinking, putting myself in French shoes, so to speak, that it's not out of the question to start discussing Gaza and Israel, because there are some commonalities in the French position, which has often at the UN refrained from taking the side of Israel and abstain in some cases, because the rhetorics of China regarding an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian aid, and so forth, is something that could resonate. That would be, I would say, a kind of rhetorical and diplomatic gain for China. I'm not sure that the French are ready to concede it, but to me, it's a possibility if one looks for, positive things to be taken out of the meeting. I would be amazed, given that President of the Commission von der Leyen is going to be here, if the French immediately made significant noises on rescinding the anti-dumping investigation on cars. But I note that the auto industry in Europe is now in complete disarray. Everybody bargaining for himself with the Chinese, literally, with whatever leverage each company has. And though the setting is not particularly good for the anti-dumping method or the anti-dumping results to be approved by the Council, that's going to be a big fight. And I think that because for Xi Jinping, Europe is really an economic issue. It's not a strategic issue. I don't think they take us very seriously. They're happy to cash in if we distance ourselves from America, and they keep repeating to us that we should. But in fact, they know that whether we distance ourselves or not doesn't change a hell of a lot the basic strategic situation, which is they are confronting America.
Thank you, Francois. I would, after this, it would be really interesting to unpack what you and Noah think about the future of the auto sector in Europe. But before that, Noah, what are your 2 or 3 deliverables for the visits from a German point of view, since they were invited to this dinner, and from the Hungarian point of view as well?
Well, first I have to correct Francois for a glaring omission. Scholz got apples as well as beef. Don't forget the apples, Francois. He did not get pork. Look, I fully agree with Francois. We're kind of beyond the point, I think, in this relationship where we can expect big deliverables from meetings like this. I think the big aim from Macron's perspective, from von der Leyen's perspective, is really to have the opportunity to sit down with Xi Jinping and reiterate the message on trade, on China, Russia. Opportunities to sit down with Xi are rare. We don't know what he hears from the people under him. So I think this is another opportunity for European leaders to sit down and explain the seriousness of their concerns about China's support for Russia, I think there will be a message that that the G7 could move, could have no other option but to move towards more robust sanctions against Chinese companies if the government in Beijing is not cracking down on these companies that are transferring technologies to Russia. Look, I think probably if you ask French cognac makers, they would hope for some deliverable from Xi, some pledge that Beijing will not retaliate if this EV investigation goes ahead. I don't think they're going to get that. I think the EV investigation is going to go ahead, and even if we know that German car makers don't like it, we know that Scholz, based on what he said in Beijing, doesn't like it. I don't see a way that the Germans can stop this, although I believe there are some concerns in Brussels these days that it could try. So I think we need to go into this with low expectations. And if we look at the other legs of the trip beyond Paris, the message really will be, I assume there will be some event around the 25th anniversary of the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. So there will be that message coming out of this. And there will be, in Hungary, there's going to be, I believe, some sort of ceremony to mark the investment by a Chinese car company in Hungary. So from the Chinese perspective, those are the deliverables. From the Hungarian and Serbian perspective, perhaps also. I don't expect big deliverables on the Paris leg.
Thank you, Noah. Over to you, Stefan, on especially Serbia.
Well, first I have to notice that the context in which we are looking at the grand picture of EU or European-China relationship is much different than the one when we are talking about bilateral relationship between Serbia and China. And I think that Serbian approach has been often a little bit more pragmatistic. And I would actually state that the first deliverable that will happen out of the visit is the visit itself, because it will provide additional legitimacy and additional leverage to the current ruling majority in Serbia, including the Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, with the fact that he and his party and his government managed to bring another high-level political leader that has a global presence to a small country like Serbia. But when it comes to the more specific deliverables, the one that obviously has been on Serbian radar for years is money. And that money is coming to Serbia either through foreign direct investment. As I mentioned, China has in 2021 became the sole biggest provider of foreign direct investment for Serbia. To put it simply, China is investing more than any individual European country currently in Serbia. And for a country and for a government that lives and dies out of the economic progress numbers, that is a very, very important aspect of the cooperation. So basically, there will be examination of what new projects can Serbia and China do together. Just yesterday, we had an announcement that the Chinese company Power China will construct a national football stadium, which is supposed to be built by 2026. So in that premise, with that premise and in that sense, new agreements that are either financed by the Chinese loans or potentially a foreign direct investment. The second deliverable is continuous support on the principle of territorial integrity. That is probably the sole most important political alignment between Serbia and China at this point. On one side, Serbia, although participates in the dialogue process facilitated by European Union when it comes to the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, still seeks actively partners in disputing the Kosovar independence on a global scale. And China was quite vocal, not against the statehood of Kosovo, but for the respect of the principle of territorial integrity, for very clear reasons, not because even it loves Serbia that much, but because it goes very nice in its favor and in spreading the message about what the stance of Beijing is on the principle of territorial integrity. And finally, the third deliverable is a message about the need of reshaping the global governance system. This one goes more to China than for Serbia, who has been quite vocal about this, but on much smaller scale. And rightfully mentioned the bombing of the Chinese embassy, which will be marked the 25th year anniversary on May 7th, will be a chance to once again reiterate what China has been saying for years now, and that is that there is a need from Chinese perspective for the reshaping of the global governance, and the visit to Belgrade could be the best stage to do so, because Serbia is the one that has been riding the both waves, so both practicing partnerships with the countries from the Western liberal democracies, but also Eastern not so democratic countries, or the ones that are in line with what the liberal democratic values today are.
Thank you, Stefan. Dave, what's the view from the US side? You know, von der Leyen has pushed a very strong agenda and tried to keep EU unity. There are elections on both sides. I think also the good relations between the EU and the US also hinged on the relationship between the two leaders. What are your views on where the US is at now and where it would be in 6 months on EU
Well, I'll stay away from speculating on what happens in November. But I think, you know, and this has already been mentioned, I think, by Noah, you know, you just had the visit by Secretary of State Blinken to China, and then before that, Secretary Yellen. And if you look at U.S. priorities as it relates to China, they're, you know, very similar right now to what the Europeans are focused on. The message was on, you know, China needing to address overcapacity, China not kind of using this state-led manufacturing push to save its economy at the costs of these nascent green industries in the United States. And this is also obviously a big concern for Europe, economic security issues. And you mentioned, Ms. von der Leyen, we've mentioned already, you know, Germany's China strategy. There has been in the United States, in Washington, a fair amount of hope in terms of watching where Europe has been going on China, particularly over the last year. I think Ms. von der Leyen's speech was a little over a year ago now on de-risking, and kind of putting some hope in the sense that we can be more aligned on these issues, economic issues, technology issues as they relate to China. We have the Trade and Technology Council, which is meant to kind of create more alignment on those issues between Washington and Brussels. And so I think the hope out of this visit is mostly a negative hope, which is there's nothing that comes out of this that further, you know, throws a wrench in hopes that we can be more aligned on some of these issues, because I think there is a genuine understanding in Washington, and particularly in the Biden administration, that without alignment with Brussels and hopefully with the key member states in Europe on these issues, whatever kind of progress we make on economic security, on things like you know, investment screening, outbound investment screening, and also dealing with these overcapacity issues, is not going to be very productive. And that also extends to the tech space, right, and export controls and important dynamics involving the Netherlands and others on ensuring that there's controls on technologies, emerging technologies that relate to national security issues. So I think the hope out of this is that you don't have, coming out of particularly the visit to France, something that indicates that level of alignment is not going to be there going forward, and that the divisions that I mentioned already and that we've talked about within Europe do not put at risk all the progress that at least we've started to make in terms of taking a more aligned, tougher approach to China on a range of different topics. And I think, you know, in the same spirit, we all, you know, kind of let Francois or others talk about it. We're kind of focused the last time Macron met with Xi, and the kind of comments on the plane afterwards that kind of took over the narrative on it about Taiwan and not following the U.S. lead. I think there's certainly a hope from the United States that there won't kind of be any comments that show significant daylight between the U.S. And key partners in Europe on some of these issues that dominate the narrative. And then lastly, I'll just say on the Serbian-Hungary point, I mean, I think from the United States, there's a hope and an understanding that that very tight relationship that China has with both of those countries, and Stefan has laid out very nicely all the contours of those relationships, that remains contained to those countries, right? I think there's been, more broadly a sense that Central and Eastern Europe, even more than the rest of Europe, has kind of been awakened to the false promises of the Belt and Road Initiative, and of course have been very closely paying attention to China's support for Russia. The 17+1, institution basically fell apart over the last several years, and so I think from the United States perspective, just expecting that those relationships are going to deepen, and that you're going to have Xi Jinping showcasing its close friends in Europe and in the EU, in the Hungary case, and in the Western Balkans and Serbia, but that is not representative of where Central and Eastern Europe is going on the China front.
Thank you, Dave. Just before we turn to EVs, Francois, given the impact that Macron's comments on Taiwan had during the last visit, do you have a quick response as to what we should expect in terms of messaging from him this time? You're on mute, Sir Francois.
Sorry. I don't have a sense of how and when Macron speaks out on these issues. I think he very much holds to sticking to what he thinks is a median line, a balanced position, which is not the same as being a balancing power, by the way. The translation in English somehow exaggerates his position. But look at the interview he gave just a few days ago, where he speaks as much of being autonomous from the United States in terms of decision-making, not having to align. In fact, doesn't speak a hell of a lot about China. That doesn't mean he doesn't have China on his mind, but in practice, he wants to be shielded from unwanted decisions or uncoordinated decisions from the US, and that's going to remain. I think it's going to reappear from time to time. Does he use it opportunistically to try and gain brownie points, or to sort of, find points of convergence with Xi Jinping? At this point, I'm not so sure, because there's been the Russian experience with Putin, for example, and because the fallout from the trip in Beijing, and especially the interview on the plane back, which has been mentioned, was catastrophic. But I have no doubt that he will not be on the forefront about Taiwan, that he will leave it to others, perhaps to the EU Parliament or to the United States. And I have no doubt that he will still try to, in effect, do something that the Biden administration has also been trying to do, which is keep engagement, keep talking, keep trying, and getting the Chinese and Xi Jinping to move their position. So in terms of rhetorics, I think he's not going to be controversial, unless, of course, President Xi Jinping decides to really become angry publicly about some of the developments of the past few weeks. That could happen. I'm wondering about the photography, the photo that was taken at the Elysee of shaking hands with the representative of the Dalai Lama and with the diplomatic delegate for the so-called delegate from Taiwan, de facto ambassador, looking nearby. That's not a very good backdrop, probably, for the meeting. But my feeling is, on balance, Xi Jinping will do his best to ignore it, to stick to his line, which is France is now non-aligned, autonomous country, trying to steer Europe perhaps in another direction. We have friendly relations from 60 years back. It won't mean a thing in terms of actual concession. And if I was a manufacturer or seller of cognac, no, I would still be very worried about what's going to happen in the next few weeks. But that's going to show up in words. Mr. Xi Jinping does not always announce in advance what his actions will be.
Thank you, Francois. I have one audience question for Dave, but before that, I really, really want to hear both Noah and Francois on the reports you both wrote at a few days interval, I think, in April on the future of the auto sector in Europe. These papers respond to the EU having launched an anti-subsidy investigation on EVs in October 2023. So starting with Noah, what are for you the recommendations for the future of the auto sector in Europe? And just a reminder that we have 15 minutes late and I have one audience question. So if you could just answer broadly in a few minutes what you think. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I did read Francois's paper and thought it was excellent. We came out with a paper about a week ago, I think, which essentially we looked at the consumer prices of cars exported from China, both Chinese brands, European, US brands like Tesla, the prices that they sell them in China and in the US and in Europe. And we looked at the costs, and the conclusion we came to, and I think it echoes what Francois wrote, is that Chinese brands like BYD can take quite high duties from the European Commission and still make a profit in Europe. So in our paper, based on past cases and based on conversations we had with various officials, we expect the Commission to impose duties, provisional duties, probably before July in the 15 to 30% range. We make the argument based on the numbers that the EU would have to impose duties of 50% or more to seriously slow down a company like BYD. Now, I don't think we can expect duties at that level, which means, and this takes us to a speech that Margareta Vestager, the competition commissioner in Brussels, gave a couple of weeks ago at Princeton University. It's going to force Europe to look at other measures. Vestager described the use of trade defense and level playing field tools as a sort of whack-a-mole approach and called for a more systematic, comprehensive response to the distortions from Chinese overcapacity, subsidies, etc. And so I think this is going to be a discussion, whether it's environmental criteria, which France has used in its subsidy scheme for EVs, whether it's labor rights, whether it's data or cybersecurity standards. There is going to be a debate, not under this commission, but I think under the next commission, about additional measures that can be taken to shield European industry.
François, over to you on your recommendations.
I fully agree with Noah, and I read with even greater interest the actual price comparisons they made. I draw further conclusions from those findings. One, we do have a problem of overpricing cars in Europe compared to the US, compared to Japan, not only compared to China. Japanese companies, for example, make volume in the US, producing in the US, largely make profits in Europe over volume, even if they do produce a bit in Europe. So this is not completely new, and it's a real challenge to the car industry. Second, unfortunately, the only thing that might help us would be if the next administration, read my lips, Dave, it would be a different one in this case, would impose such high duties on Chinese cars that we would have to follow suit unless we want to be the market of last resort. And that might provide a shield from what is otherwise going to be a tsunami of Chinese cars once they know how to distribute them, once they find a way to repair the batteries, and there are still issues there. Three, we're not going to avoid Chinese cars completely. So what is absolutely damning, what is really hurting, and this has deteriorated even after we wrote our pieces, Noah, is the fact that several countries are now negotiating each for themselves car factories with awful conditions. Italy has just signed a deal for essentially a knockdown kits entirely imported from China and assembled near Naples. Hungary itself, it's a 100% BYD owned factory in Hungary with sweet conditions for environments which would not be accepted elsewhere in Europe. Spain has just negotiated a deal with, shall we say, minor, not an overly important Chinese producer. The French are now trying each for themselves to reach settlement with some Chinese partners. So the net result of the German auto industry, chiefly Daimler and BMW, incredible lobbying against any form of duties, has been to push every one of their competitors in the arms of the Chinese. I'm not sure this will ultimately help Daimler and BMW, to be specific. And I know that VW, for example, the head of VW in China, has recently expressed his worry about the fate of subcontractors, suppliers in Europe, voicing quite a different stand on that perspective from Daimler. And of course, because VW is not a premium brand manufacturer in the main, and even though it has huge interests in China, it's going to be challenged first. My solution for this is indeed a degree of shielding European industry, but we have to do it very carefully, because in the past they avoided change through the price protection that they enjoyed. They kept profits. So we cannot, go back on our greening design, and we should find ways that the shield is effective in transforming the auto industry rather than protecting the present industry as it runs. And that's a difficult task, I recognize. But the situation is going to be there in other industries. I just read a report, for example, on the offshore wind and electrolysis industry, which arrives pretty much at the same recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you, François. I'll turn on to audience questions now. We actually have time for more than one. So I will start with Noah again. What is the future of the EU's de-risking agenda, particularly as we look to the European elections and the next European Commission mandates? Can Europe do much more to reduce its reliance on China?
Well, I think this is a really big question, Leonie. Look, I think a lot depends on whether Ursula von der Leyen returns as president of the European Commission. She has, as we know, launched this economic security strategy. She is the one behind the very robust use of the EU's trade defense tools, level playing field tools. So while I don't think, if we have a change at the top of the Commission, that we're going to go into reverse and Europe's policies towards China will be turned on their head. I do think that over the past year, especially, it has been von der Leyen who's really been driving the agenda in Europe on China and forcing the member states to engage with that agenda. So I do think whether she's able to stay on as head of the Commission, and we'll only know that after the elections. I was interested to read last week that Macron is talking to Giorgia Meloni about perhaps installing Mario Draghi at the top of the Commission. I take all of that with a bit of a grain of salt. My sense is that Macron probably wants to send von der Leyen the message that she shouldn't count on his support, that he may come asking for certain presents and she better deliver, or he can withdraw his support. I think it's going to be very difficult for Scholz not to back her. So I still think she has a good chance. But, Europe's de-risking strategy is, it has an uncertain future. I think, de-risking is in the eye of the beholder. I was just talking with someone here in Berlin yesterday who is kind of at the heart of this debate in the German government. You know, he admitted to me that that companies are you know are all implementing their own version of de-risking. And we heard from, for example, the Mercedes CEO, Ola Kolenius, that de-risking for him means more investment in China. And I think a few of the other car makers would probably agree. So I think there are big questions about this. Of course, the Commission has goals under its Critical Raw Materials Act, Net Zero Industry Act, to reduce dependencies on China. But this is going to be a hard slog, and I think, you know, we won't know the answer to this for another 5 to 10 years, probably.
Thank you, Noah. On a also long-term perspective, because EU integration is so high on the agenda right now, and very important topic for the Europe Center as well. How has China's investments in Serbia impacted European integration, according to you, Stefan?
Well, Chinese investment per se did not impact the European integration of Serbia. How the Serbian government treated some of the aspects of those investments have been quite harmful to the state of rule of law in Serbia, also has increased a certain negative impacts when it comes to the environmental protection, and we had some cases of mistreatment of labor and labor forces. Serbia as a country has been very, very welcomed to the foreign investors at large. Serbian model of economic development pretty much lives and dies out of the foreign direct investment. What has happened over the past 15 years, especially since 2016 and then 2018, that Chinese presence in the FDI portion of Serbian economy has been steadily increasing. And with the increased number of Chinese companies being present, we have seen more and more mistreatments of some of the standards, procedures, rules, and laws that have been established as part of Serbia's approach towards the EU integration process. Is Serbia dependent on the Chinese investment? No. Is Serbia dependent on the investments that are coming from European Union? No. Is China alternative to the European integration partnership with China in different aspects? Again, that's going to be a triple no from my side. But what has been slowly creating a distance between Serbia as a relevant candidate for the European membership is that our government has unfortunately decided that the short-term benefits of economic development have been more important than building the democratic institutions and pretty much practicing the values and practices that are in line with democratic liberal values that should be, not always, but should be in the heart of European Union and transatlantic partnership as well. China, on another side, was very good facilitator of those trends, not really making Serbia do anything to improve what has not been working. But on another side, that is why China was such an appealing partner for Serbia, because a lot of those financial agreements in the shape of loans and foreign direct investment came without any conditionality, which was very, very welcomed by the Serbian government and Serbian officials, who have been, again, steadily developing partnership with China in that area for more than a decade now.
Thank you, Stefan. I have one last question from the audience before we wrap up for Dave. Given the evolution of the relationship between China and Russia after the war in Ukraine, what are some of the how do you see the relationship impacting Europe, and do you have any views on where this discussion could move forward on the European side?
Well, that's a good question. We could probably spend a whole additional hour on that. I'll just say from the China side, I mean, I think we've all watched what's happened with Russia's military efforts in Ukraine, and then we've all seen what's happening with Russia's economy. So the question is often, why is there still value to China from this relationship with Russia, given its failings that we've seen, and certainly the damage to China's relationships globally, especially in Europe, that has come from China's support for Russia. Russia, just quickly, is China's most important strategic partner, without question. So it's going to continue to maintain that relationship on the security front, in international organizations, on the messaging front, in an effort to revise the global order. So as that relates to Europe, I mean, I'm curious if we had time what the others on the panel think, but I think China is clearly betting that what it can do is maintain that relationship with Russia, which it's unwilling to give up, and still maintain close ties with Europe, as I said at the outset, because of China's economic importance to Europe and China's hope that it can continue to create this wedge between the US and Brussels and key member states on key topics, and that these movements toward a tougher position on China will ultimately not stand the test of time because of that economic importance. I think, longer term, when we talk about the strategic importance of Russia to China, part of that is in the notion of if something were to happen in the security front in East Asia, particularly a Taiwan Strait type of crisis, that you could have Russia doing things in the European theater that would distract NATO, would distract the United States, would distract key European partners from participating and supporting efforts to push back on Chinese aggression in East Asia. So I think that's part of China's calculus here. But I know we're out of time. I'll stop there. But I think this is a really big question, and a lot of policymakers in Washington are thinking about, obviously, these connections between China and Russia, as well as with Iran and North Korea, and what this means for the future, and how the US and Europe and our allies in Northeast Asia should be thinking about those connections going forward.
Thank you so much, Dave, for these concluding words on which kind of leaves an opening for maybe a next conversation on what the US thinks of strategic simultaneity and how does that relate to Europe and to China as well. So I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here, especially on what I see as the two outstanding topics for this big visit. So economic issues with the EU at the center of it, and then Russia-China relations, of course, given the importance of this agenda for Europe. So thank you so much again for our panelists for joining today, for our audience as well. And we'll certainly, as I mentioned before, pick up these conversations again this year. So stay tuned, and thanks again.
Thanks.